Dr. Leah Foster, a top trauma surgeon who's overcome countless barriers to reach the pinnacle of her career. But her toughest challenge isn't in the operating room. On a routine flight, a life-threatening emergency leads to an unexpected encounter with a powerful CEO, setting off a series of events that will challenge Leah's beliefs, push her to her limits, and force her to confront the biases that have shadowed her entire journey. How will Leah handle the pressures from both her career and the demands of a world not built for her? Will she rise above or be overwhelmed by it all? Watch the full story to find out, and if you're inspired by Leah's journey, leave a comment and subscribe to Brave Hearts for more stories of courage and change. Dr. Leah Foster slid into her first-class seat with a sigh of relief, adjusting the leather strap of her carry-on bag under the seat in front of her. She took a moment to appreciate the quiet calm of the cabin, a rare luxury for someone who spent most of her days in the chaotic world of trauma surgery at Mount Sinai Hospital in New York. At 36 years old, Leah had earned this moment, but that didn't make it feel any less foreign. As the hum of the engines filled the cabin, Leah settled into the plush seat, closing her eyes briefly. This was the first time in months, maybe even years, that she was taking a vacation. And even now, as the plane prepared to take off, she could feel the familiar tug of guilt in her chest. The weight of unfinished surgeries, the waiting patients, and the endless rounds at the hospital loomed over her like a shadow. But her colleagues insisted. "You'll burn out if you don't step away for a bit," they had warned, practically shoving her onto this plane. So here she was, on a flight to Miami, hoping to let go of the constant pressure she carried like a second skin. Leah glanced out the window, watching the last few passengers trickle in. She couldn't help but notice the looks she got as people passed her seat. Curious glances, a flicker of surprise, perhaps even judgment. A young black woman in first class still seemed to stir something in people no matter how much time passed. Leah met those gazes with calm indifference, her dark brown eyes steady and unwavering. She was used to this. From her earliest days in medical school, she had been aware of the expectations placed on her, not just as a woman, but as a black woman in a predominantly white male-dominated field. People often assumed she didn't belong, but Leah had made a career out of proving people wrong. Her fingers lightly grazed the stethoscope she always carried in her bag, a reminder of who she was and the responsibility she bore. It was never far from her, even now, on this brief escape from her life. Leah had spent most of her life fighting to prove she belonged. Born and raised in Detroit, the daughter of a school teacher and a nurse, she had always been determined to succeed. Her parents had instilled in her the belief that education was the key to a better life, but they also warned her that the road would not be easy. Growing up in a modest neighborhood where opportunities were scarce, Leah had witnessed firsthand how systemic inequalities shaped the lives of those around her. Her father, a high school teacher, had been her first role model. He taught Leah the importance of hard work, discipline, and most importantly, resilience. He often stayed late at school, tutoring students who had been written off by the system, believing that every child deserved a chance. Leah had inherited that same drive, that same determination to rise above the limitations imposed on her by society. Her mother, a nurse who worked long shifts at the local hospital, had been Leah's inspiration for entering the medical field. Leah would watch her mother come home after a grueling day, her face lined with exhaustion but her spirit unbroken. It was her mother's stories of healing, of caring for those who couldn't care for themselves, that had sparked Leah's interest in medicine. By the time Leah was in high school, she knew she wanted to be a doctor, but it wasn't just about medicine for Leah. It was about proving that she could succeed in a world that didn't always make space for women like her. From the moment she set her sights on becoming a doctor, She knew she would have to work twice as hard, be twice as good, and never show weakness. Her parents had raised her to understand that, as a black woman, she would be judged more harshly than her peers, and that her success would not just be for herself, but for everyone who came after her. Leah had earned a full scholarship to Stanford University, a testament to her academic brilliance. But when she arrived at Stanford, she quickly realized that the challenges she faced in Detroit were only the beginning. Stanford was a world of privilege, a world where most of her classmates came from wealthy families, attended private schools, and never had to worry about money or opportunity. Leah, on the other hand, was constantly aware of the invisible divide that separated her from her peers. She worked harder than anyone else, spending long hours in the library, acing every exam, and earning the respect of her professors. But there were always the whispers, the subtle doubts from classmates and even faculty that she had only gotten into Stanford because of affirmative action. Leah knew that wasn't true. She had earned her place. But the microaggressions and casual racism weighed on her, even as she pushed forward. After Stanford, Leah went on to Harvard Medical School, where the pressure only increased. She was one of the few black students in her class, and once again, she had to prove herself. The long hours, the grueling shifts, the emotional toll of working in trauma medicine, it all piled on. But Leah had no choice but to endure it. She had come too far to let anyone or anything stand in her way. By the time she finished her residency at Mount Sinai Hospital in New York, Leah had established herself as one of the top trauma surgeons in the country. Her reputation for remaining calm under pressure, her surgical precision, and her ability to make split-second decisions earned her the respect of her colleagues. But even now, with all of her accomplishments, there were still those who doubted her. Leah had learned to live with that doubt, to use it as fuel for her success. But sitting on this plane on her way to a much-needed vacation, she couldn't help but wonder if it would ever be enough. If she would ever reach a point where she didn't feel like she had to prove herself, where she could just be. She glanced at her phone, tempted to check her email one last time before the flight took off. There was always something urgent, an upcoming surgery, a patient who needed her attention, a colleague seeking advice. But this time, Leah resisted the urge. This was her time, and she was going to take it. As the flight attendants began their safety demonstration, Leah closed her eyes and tried to relax. For the first time in months, she was determined to let go of the weight she carried, even if only for a few days. Just as Leah was beginning to find some semblance of peace, she heard a gruff voice nearby. A man in his mid-50s was struggling to shove an oversized carry-on into the overhead bin. His face was flushed with effort, and he muttered under his breath as he battled with the luggage. Leah watched for a moment, debating whether to offer help, but the man's determined scowl suggested he wasn't looking for assistance. The flight attendant approached, her tone polite but firm. "Sir, I'm afraid that bag is too large for the overhead compartment. We'll need to check it." The man's irritation was palpable. "Are you kidding me?" he barked. "I've flown first class for years and never had an issue with this bag." "I understand, sir, but for the safety of everyone on board, we need to follow protocol," the flight attendant explained. With a huff, the man finally relinquished his bag, handing it over to the flight attendant with a muttered, "Ridiculous." He dropped heavily into the seat next to Leah, his large frame spilling over the armrest. Leah felt a twinge of discomfort, but kept her expression neutral. "First class isn't what it used to be," the man grumbled, clearly looking for someone to agree with him. Leah offered a polite smile, not particularly interested in engaging but unwilling to be rude. "It can be frustrating," she said mildly, "but I'm sure they're just following safety protocols." The man turned to her, his eyes narrowing slightly as he took her in. Leah could almost see the judgment flicker across his face as he registered her presence, a young black woman traveling in first class. His lips curled into a sarcastic smile. "Right," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "And what would you know about safety? You some kind of expert?" Leah's jaw tightened. She had encountered this tone before, the subtle disbelief that someone like her could possibly be qualified to speak on anything, let alone something as serious as safety. But Leah had learned long ago how to handle these situations with poise. "Actually," she replied calmly, meeting his gaze without flinching, "I'm a trauma surgeon, Dr. Leah Foster." For a moment the man looked taken aback. He blinked, clearly not expecting that response, but he quickly recovered, his expression shifting from surprise to mild skepticism. "A trauma surgeon, huh? That's impressive." Leah nodded, her expression cool. "Thank you." The man seemed to be processing her words, as if trying to reconcile the image he had in his head with the reality sitting next to him. Leah could almost see the wheels turning. She had experienced this countless times before, the moment when someone's assumptions about her collided with the truth. He extended his hand, albeit reluctantly. "Brian Whitfield, CEO of Whitfield Construction." Leah shook his hand briefly, already sensing that this conversation wasn't going to end with a simple introduction. The plane had begun to taxi toward the runway, and Leah hoped the conversation would end here, but Brian wasn't done. "So what kind of surgeries do you do, doctor?" "Foster?" he asked, his tone still carrying that edge of disbelief. Leah kept her tone polite but firm. "I specialize in trauma surgery, car crashes, gunshot wounds, emergencies that require immediate intervention." Brian raised an eyebrow. Impressive for someone your age. Leah's patience was beginning to wear thin. She had heard that tone too many times, the barely disguised surprise that someone like her could have achieved so much, so young, but Leah wasn't interested in playing into his expectations. "I've been practicing for nearly a decade now," she replied evenly. "I completed my residency at Mount Sinai Hospital in New York." Brian leaned back in his seat, clearly still processing what she had said. "Must be nice," he remarked after a pause. "A vacation in Miami. I remember when I was starting out, I could barely afford a weekend at the beach." Leah bit back the urge to roll her eyes. She had no interest in comparing their lives. "I've saved for this trip," she said evenly. "It's important to take care of yourself in a high-stress profession." Brian snorted. "Self-care," he muttered, as if the concept was foreign to him. "That's what they're calling it these days." Before Leah could respond, a commotion at the front of the cabin caught her attention. A man near the front of the plane had slumped over in his seat, clutching his chest and gasping for air. The murmur of concerned passengers filled the cabin, and Leah's instincts kicked in immediately. She unbuckled her seatbelt and stood. "I'm a doctor," Leah called to the flight attendants as she made her way down the aisle. "Let me help." The man's face was pale, his breathing labored. Beads of sweat dotted his forehead, and his hand was clenched tightly over his heart. Leah's mind raced as she quickly assessed the situation. "Chest pain," the man gasped. "Can't breathe." Leah knelt beside him, her focus laser-sharp. "I need the first aid kit," she told the flight attendants calmly but urgently. "And if there's aspirin, nitroglycerin, anything for heart attack symptoms, bring it now." The passengers around them watched in stunned silence as Leah took control of the situation. The man's condition was critical, and Leah knew she had to act fast. A nurse from a nearby seat came forward to assist, and together they worked to stabilize the man. As Leah worked, she could feel the weight of the cabin's collective gaze on her. It wasn't the first time she had been in a high-stakes situation like this, but there was something different about doing it on a plane with so many people watching. There was no sterile operating room, no team of doctors and nurses backing her up, just Leah, her training, and her instincts. After what felt like an eternity, the man's breathing began to stabilize. His color returned, and his grip on his chest loosened. Leah let out a small sigh of relief as she sat back on her heels. The passengers erupted into applause, but Leah barely registered it. Her focus was still on the man in front of her, making sure he was out of danger. When she was confident that he was stable, she nodded to the flight attendants, who helped him into a more comfortable position. Leah returned to her seat, her heart still racing from the adrenaline. Brian stared at her, his expression a mixture of awe and what looked like regret. Brian was uncharacteristically quiet after Leah returned to her seat. His earlier arrogance had dissipated, replaced by something closer to humility. Leah could feel his eyes on her, but she didn't engage. She was still coming down from the emotional intensity of the emergency, her mind replaying the events over and over again. After a few minutes of silence, Brian spoke. "That was incredible," he said, his voice softer than before. "You saved that man's life." Leah nodded but didn't say anything. She had done her job, that was all. "I didn't realize," Brian continued, his tone hesitant, "that you were really—" Leah cut him off, her voice calm but firm. "Really what? A doctor?" Brian flushed, clearly uncomfortable. "I didn't mean it like that," he muttered. "I just didn't expect—" Leah turned to him, meeting his gaze directly. "Didn't expect what? Could a black woman be a trauma surgeon? That I could be just as qualified, just as skilled as anyone else in this seat?" Brian's face reddened even more. "No, He stopped, fumbling for the right words. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to come off like that." Leah studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. "You made an assumption," she said quietly. "And you're not the first person to do that. But what matters is whether you're willing to challenge that assumption going forward." Brian swallowed hard, nodding slowly. "You're right," he admitted. "I've been blind to a lot of things. I've never had to think about what it's like for someone in your position. I'm sorry." Leah didn't respond right away. She had heard apologies like this before, people who realized, often too late, that their assumptions had been rooted in bias. But words were easy. Real change, real understanding, required more than that. "It's not enough to apologize," Leah said after a pause. "You have to be willing to learn, to understand why you made those assumptions in the first place, and to work on changing them." Brian nodded again, his face serious. "I will," he said quietly. "I promise." Leah gave him a small nod, but she wasn't convinced. Promises were easy to make, but change was hard. Still, she appreciated that he was at least willing to try. The rest of the flight passed in relative silence. Leah closed her eyes, trying to let go of the tension that had built up in her chest. She had come to Miami to escape the pressures of her life, but it seemed that no matter where she went, the challenges she faced as a black woman in America followed her. As the plane began its descent into Miami, Leah took a deep breath, reminding herself why she had come here in the first place. She needed rest, she needed peace, and she needed time to recharge. The weight of her work, the expectations placed on her, the constant need to prove herself, it could wait. For now, Leah was determined to take care of herself. The plane landed smoothly in Miami, and as Leah stepped off the jet bridge into the warmth of the terminal, she was hit by the humidity and heat of the Miami air. It was a welcome change from the chilly winds of New York, and Leah allowed herself a moment to take it all in. She had been working nonstop for months, and now, for the first time in what felt like forever, she was miles away from the beeping monitors, emergency alarms, and frantic voices that made up her day-to-day life as a trauma surgeon. Her suitcase rolled behind her as she walked toward the baggage claim, her thoughts drifting to her plan for the next few days. She had booked a quiet beachfront hotel far from the noise of the city, with the hopes of spending her time by the ocean, reading, maybe even trying to catch up on some sleep. There were no scheduled surgeries, no rounds to prepare for, no residents demanding her attention. It was just her. But as she stood by the carousel, waiting for her luggage to arrive, her mind couldn't help but drift back to Brian Whitfield and the strange interaction they'd had on the plane. His condescending remarks, the assumptions he had made, and then the shift in his demeanor after she had saved the man's life. It wasn't the first time Leah had encountered someone like Brian, someone who underestimated her because of her race and gender. And though he had apologized, Leah knew better than to put a lot of stock in those kinds of apologies. Change, if it came at all, didn't come easily. As the carousel began to turn, Leah spotted her luggage and pulled it off the belt. She was ready to leave the airport behind, to shed the weight of the last few hours and immerse herself in the calm she so desperately needed. She hailed a taxi and gave the driver the address to her hotel, leaning back in the seat as they sped toward the beach. Outside the car window, Miami's vibrant cityscape unfolded, palm trees, the sound of Cuban music, the sun-soaked streets filled with people enjoying the heat. Leah smiled at herself. She had never been the type to take time off, but maybe this trip was exactly what she needed. The car pulled up in front of her hotel, a modest but beautiful resort with sprawling gardens and private access to the beach. Leah checked in. Her shoulders began to relax as the weight of the last few months slowly began to lift. Her room was spacious, with large windows that overlooked the ocean, and as soon as she dropped her bags on the bed, Leah felt a sense of peace wash over her. She stood at the window for a moment, watching the waves crash against the shore, the sun setting over the horizon. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she could breathe again. Leah hadn't been at the hotel for more than a few hours when she ran into Brian Whitfield again. She had been walking through the lobby, heading toward the beach for a quick walk before dinner, when she spotted him standing near the entrance, deep in conversation with someone who appeared to be a colleague. Leah felt a surge of irritation. Of all the people to run into, why him? She had come here to get away from the stress of her life, not to engage with a man who had already made his biases clear. She had saved his life, well, more accurately, the life of another passenger. But in doing so, it felt like she had also become entangled in Brian's personal journey of self-realization, something she wasn't particularly interested in facilitating. Brian caught her eye before she could turn away, and Leah saw his expression shift from surprise to something resembling awkward gratitude. He excused himself from the conversation and walked over to her, his face flushed as if he wasn't entirely sure how to approach her. "Dr. Foster," he began, his voice tentative. "I didn't expect to see you here." Leah forced a smile, nodding politely. "It's a small world," she said, her tone neutral. She had no intention of engaging in a long conversation with him, but she also didn't want to be rude. Brian cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened on the plane," he said, "and I realized I owe you a lot more than just an apology." Leah raised an eyebrow, her curiosity piqued despite herself. She crossed her arms, waiting for him to continue. "I mean, you saved that man's life," Brian went on, "and you showed me something important. I've been thinking about how I've walked through life without ever really considering what it must be like for someone like you. I never had to question whether people took me seriously or doubted my abilities, but you—" Leah held up a hand, cutting him off. She wasn't interested in hearing his epiphany. "Brian, I appreciate your apology, but you don't owe me anything. What you do with what you've learned is up to you." Brian looked taken aback by her directness, but he nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "I understand," he he said. "I just wanted to say that I'm going to make an effort." To change, Leah gave him a small nod, her patience wearing thin. "Good luck with that," she said, and with that, she turned and walked away, heading toward the beach. She wasn't interested in playing the role of Brian's moral guide. She had come here to escape, not to be reminded of the constant emotional labor that came with being a black woman in America. As she stepped onto the warm sand, the sound of the ocean filling her ears, Leah let out a deep breath. She had done her part, and now it was time to focus on herself. Leah spent the next few days in relative peace, finally allowing herself to unwind. She woke up early, took long walks along the beach, and spent her afternoons lounging by the pool with a book in hand. The constant pressure that had weighed on her shoulders for so long began to ease, and Leah found herself rediscovering parts of herself that had been buried beneath the demands of her career. But even in the quiet moments, Leah's mind couldn't entirely escape the world she had left behind. Thoughts of the hospital, of her patients, of the residents she mentored, flitted through her mind like distant echoes. She wondered how Amanda Richards, a second-year surgical resident under her wing, was handling things without her guidance. Amanda had potential, but Leah had seen firsthand how easily that potential could be squandered by the biases and systemic challenges that still existed in medicine. One evening, as Leah sat on the balcony of her hotel room, watching the sun set over the ocean, her phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Dr. Sophia Martinez, her close friend and colleague at Mount Sinai. "Sophia, how's Miami? Relaxing yet?" Leah smiled, typing back a quick response. "Leah, it's beautiful here. I actually took a nap this afternoon." "Sophia, you? A nap? Miracles do happen." Leah chuckled, her shoulders relaxed a bit. Sophia always knew how to make her laugh. "Sophia, by the way, Amanda's doing well. She had surgery today. I think she's starting to find her confidence." Leah felt a surge of pride. Amanda had struggled with self-doubt ever since she started her residency, often feeling the weight of her identity as a black woman in a predominantly white, male-dominated field. Leah had taken Amanda under her wing, mentoring her and helping her navigate the challenges of residency, just as Leah's own mentors had done for her. It was rewarding to see Amanda begin to come into her own. "Leah, that's great to hear. She's got what it takes. I just hope she believes it soon." "Sophia, she's got you in her corner. She'll be fine." Leah smiled as she set her phone aside. She missed the hospital, missed work, but it was nice to know that things were running smoothly without her for a few days. The next morning, Leah was sitting by the pool, sipping on a cold glass of lemonade, when her phone buzzed with a call. She glanced at the screen, her brow furrowing when she saw that it was the hospital. For a moment, she debated whether to answer it. This was supposed to be her time off, after all. But the nagging voice in the back of her mind, the one that always worried about what might be happening in her absence, compelled her to pick up. "Dr. Foster," she said, her tone professional as she answered the call. "Leah, it's Dr. Jacobs." The voice on the other end belonged to Dr. Mark Jacobs, one of the senior surgeons at Mount Sinai. "Sorry to bother you on your vacation, but we've got a situation here, and I could use your input." Leah sat up straighter in her chair. "What's going on?" "We've got a critical patient in the ER. A young woman, late 20s, severe trauma from a car accident. Multiple fractures, internal bleeding. We're prepping for surgery, but I wanted to run the case by you before we proceed." Leah's mind immediately went into overdrive, her training kicking in as she processed the details. She had trained herself to think quickly, to make life or death decisions in seconds. Even miles away, she could picture the scene unfolding at the hospital, the team preparing for surgery, the patient fighting for her life. "Okay, Leah said, her voice steady. "Have you done an abdominal CT scan?" "Not yet," Dr. Jacobs replied. "We were about to, but I wanted to see if you had any additional thoughts." "Do the scan," Leah instructed. "Make sure you check for any signs of internal organ damage. And get a trauma team ready to assist. This could get complicated. Keep me updated on the patient's condition." "Will do," Dr. Jacobs said. "Thanks, Leah. We'll handle it from here, but I appreciate your input." Leah hung up the phone, her mind still racing. It was moments like these that reminded her why she loved her job, why she had chosen a career in trauma surgery despite the toll it took on her. The rush of adrenaline, the knowledge that her decisions could mean the difference between life and death, was exhilarating. But it was also exhausting. She set her phone down and took a deep breath, trying to shake off the lingering tension. She was on vacation, and there was nothing more she could do from here. The team at Mount Sinai was more than capable of handling the situation, and Leah needed to trust that they would make the right decisions. But as she leaned back in her chair, her heart still pounding from the call, Leah realized that no matter how far she went, she could never truly leave her work behind. It was a part of her, as much as her stethoscope, her scrubs, and the operating room. Later that evening, Leah decided to take a walk along the beach to clear her head. The sky was painted in shades of pink and orange as the sun set over the horizon, and the sound of the waves crashing against the shore was soothing. She had always found peace by the water, and tonight was no different. As she walked, her thoughts drifted back to the hospital, to the patient fighting for her life, and to Amanda, who was just beginning to find her confidence. Leah had spent so much of her career focused on being the best surgeon she could be, but in recent years, she had found just as much fulfillment in mentoring the next generation of doctors. She wanted to create a space where women, like Amanda, her, could thrive without constantly feeling like they had to prove themselves. Lost in thought, Leah didn't notice the figure walking toward her until she nearly bumped into him. "Dr. Foster." Leah blinked, startled out of her reverie. Standing in front of her once again was Brian Whitfield. She hadn't expected to see him again after their brief conversation in the hotel lobby, and now here he was, standing on the beach, looking just as awkward as he had before. "Brian," Leah said, her tone neutral. "We seem to keep running into each other." Brian offered a sheepish smile. "Yeah, seems that way. I was just taking a walk, trying to clear my head." Leah nodded, unsure of what to say. She wasn't particularly interested in striking up another conversation with Brian, but it seemed fate had other plans. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said," Brian continued, his tone serious. "About assumptions. And I realized that I've been walking through life assuming I know what people's experiences are, but I don't." Leah crossed her arms, waiting for him to continue. "I've spent my whole career building my company, making decisions that affect hundreds of people," Brian said, his voice thoughtful. "But I never really considered how my own biases were influencing those decisions. I've been blind to a lot of things, and it took that flight, and you, to open my eyes." Leah sighed, her patience wearing thin. "Brian, I'm not here to be your moral compass. What you do with your realizations is up to you." Brian nodded, his expression earnest. "I know, but I wanted to thank you for making me see things differently. I know it's not your job to educate me, but I'm grateful for what you've done." Leah studied him for a moment, her expression softening slightly. "Look, Brian, if you want to change, that's great. But it's not enough to just realize you've been wrong. You have to actively work to change the way you think and the way you treat people." Brian nodded again, his face serious. "I'm going to do that. I've already started making changes at my company. anti-bias training, more inclusive hiring practices. It's a start, but I know I've got a long way to go." Leah was silent for a moment, considering his words. She had heard promises like this before, well-meaning but often short-lived. But something about Brian's tone made her believe that he might actually follow through. "Good," Leah said finally. "But remember, it's a journey, not a destination." Brian smiled, looking relieved. "I know, and I'm committed to that journey." Leah nodded, then turned her gaze back to the ocean. The conversation had taken a turn she hadn't expected, and while she was still wary of Brian's sudden shift in perspective, she appreciated that he was at least trying. As they stood there in silence, the waves lapping at their feet, Leah felt a strange sense of closure. Brian had been a symbol of the challenges she had faced throughout her career. Men who doubted her, who made assumptions about her based on her appearance, but now it seemed that Brian was beginning to see the world through a different lens, and while Leah wasn't sure what the future held for him, she knew that she had done her part. The next day, Leah packed her bags and prepared to head back to New York. Her time in Miami had been brief, but it had given her the rest she needed, and more importantly, the clarity to continue the work she had started. As she checked out of the hotel and hailed a taxi to the airport, Leah felt a renewed sense of purpose. She wasn't just a surgeon. She was a mentor, an advocate, and a force for change. And while her work was far from over, she knew that she was on the right path. When the plane lifted off from Miami, Leah stared out the window, watching the city disappear beneath the clouds. She had come to Miami seeking peace, and while she had found it in small doses, she had also been reminded of the challenges that still lay ahead. But for the first time in a long time, Leah felt ready to face them. Leah stepped out of the terminal at JFK, the cold New York air a stark contrast to the warmth of Miami. She pulled her coat tightly around her as she hailed a cab, the familiar rhythm of the city slowly easing her back into her routine. Her brief time away had helped her recharge, but as she sat in the back seat of the taxi, watching the city lights blur past, Leah knew that the weight of her responsibilities was about to settle back onto her shoulders. The next morning, she was back at Mount Sinai, her white coat draped over her shoulders as she made her rounds in the trauma ward. The usual chaos greeted her. Patients in critical condition, residents scrambling to keep up with the fast pace of emergency medicine. But Leah felt ready. She needed the break, but now she was eager to dive back into her work. As she moved from one patient to the next, checking charts, issuing instructions, and consulting with her team, Leah was reminded of how much she loved this part of her job. The adrenaline, the urgency, the challenge of making life-saving decisions in the blink of an eye. It was what had drawn her to trauma surgery in the first place. But it wasn't just about the medicine for Leah. It was about the people, the patients whose lives she touched, and the younger doctors she mentored along the way. Leah stopped by Amanda Richards' station, watching as the young resident worked on a patient with a calm precision that Leah had come to admire. Amanda had come a long way since she first started her residency, and Leah felt a surge of pride as she observed her. "How's everything going?" Leah asked as she approached. Amanda looked up, her face lighting up at the sight of her mentor. "It's going well, Dr. Foster," she said. "We've stabilized Mr. Harris and we're prepping him for surgery." Leah nodded, glancing over the patient's chart. "Good work, Amanda. You're handling things well." Amanda smiled, a hint of relief in her expression. "Thank you. I've been working on staying calm under pressure just like you taught me." Leah chuckled softly. "You're doing great. Just remember, confidence comes with time. You've got the skills, now you just need to trust yourself." Amanda nodded, her eyes filled with gratitude. "I'll keep that in mind." As Leah moved on, her heart swelled with pride. Moments like these reminded her of why she had taken on the role of mentor, despite the additional responsibilities it added to her already full plate. She wanted to help young doctors like Amanda navigate the often hostile environment of the medical field, particularly for women of color. Leah had faced her own share of challenges, and now she was determined to make things a little easier for the next generation. But as much as she loved her work, Leah couldn't ignore the fact that the balance she had promised herself she would find after Miami was already slipping away. As the weeks passed, the demands of Leah's job began to pile up once again. Long shifts in the trauma ward, back-to-back surgeries, and the constant pressure to remain at the top of her game left little room for rest. Leah found herself staying at the hospital late into the evening, poring over patient charts and preparing for the next day's surgeries. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Sophia Martinez late one night as Leah sat in her office, reviewing a particularly difficult case. Sophia, still at the hospital. Leah sighed, rubbing her temples before typing back a quick response. Leah, you know what it is, there's always something. A few moments later, Sophia's reply came through. Sophia, you promised yourself you'd take it easy after Miami. You need to keep that promise. Leah leaned back in her chair, letting out a long breath. Sophia was right. She had made a promise to herself, but keeping that promise felt impossible when there was always another patient who needed her, another surgery that demanded her attention. But the truth was, Leah knew she couldn't keep going at this pace forever. She had already felt the signs of burnout creeping in before her vacation, and while Miami had given her a brief reprieve, she was back on the same path. She put her phone down and stared at the stack of charts in front of her. Maybe it was time to start delegating more, to trust that her team could handle things without her constant supervision. But letting go, even a little, was hard for Leah. She had spent her entire career working harder than everyone else, proving herself over and over again. It was ingrained in her. But something had to change. The next day, as Leah was in the middle of preparing for a surgery, her phone rang. She glanced at the screen and was surprised to see Brian Whitfield's name flashing across it. She hadn't expected to hear from him again after their brief encounter in Miami, and for a moment she debated whether to answer. She was in the middle of a hectic day, and she wasn't sure she had the energy for another conversation with Brian about his journey of self-awareness. But something made her pick up. "Brian," Leah said, her voice wary. "Dr. Foster. Hi. I hope I'm not interrupting," Brian said, his tone unusually hesitant. "I'm about to head into surgery, so I don't have much time," Leah replied. "What's going on?" "I just wanted to let you know that, well, I've been thinking a lot about our conversations. I've made some changes at my company, and I'm trying to be more intentional about the way I approach things," Brian said. "But that's not why I called. I actually wanted to ask you something." Leah raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Ask me what?" "Well," Brian hesitated, "I'm hosting an event for my company in a few weeks. It's part of our new diversity and inclusion initiative, and I was wondering if you'd be interested in speaking, sharing your story, your experiences. I think it would really resonate with a lot of people." Leah blinked, taken aback. She hadn't expected this. Speaking at an event for Brian's company wasn't something she had ever imagined doing, and part of her bristled at the idea of being put in the position of educating others about racism and bias. It wasn't her job to fix Brian's company or help him feel better about himself. But at the same time, Leah recognized that there was an opportunity here. If Brian was serious about making changes, maybe this was a chance to push for something meaningful, something that could make a real difference. "I'll think about it," Leah said finally, her tone cautious. "But I'm not interested in being anyone's token speaker. If I do this, it's on my terms." Brian's voice was earnest. "Of course. I wouldn't expect anything less. I think your voice could make an impact." Leah wasn't sure how to feel about that, but she promised to give it some thought. After they hung up, she sat back in her chair, contemplating the conversation. She had spent her entire career fighting to be seen as more than just a black woman in a white, male-dominated field, and the idea of being put on display at Brian's event didn't sit well with her. But maybe this was an opportunity to turn the tables, to speak her truth, not for Brian's benefit, but for herself and for others like her. Over the next few days, Leah mulled over Brian's offer. Part of her wanted to say no. She was busy enough as it was, and the idea of taking on yet another responsibility felt overwhelming. But the other part of her, the part that had dedicated her life to creating change, to making space for women like Amanda, felt like this was a moment she couldn't ignore. She confided in Sophia one evening, the two of them grabbing dinner after a long shift. "I'm torn," Leah admitted as they sat across from each other at a quiet restaurant. "On one hand, I don't want to be the black woman who shows up to educate white people about their biases. But on the other hand, maybe I could use this platform to really say something important." Sophia nodded thoughtfully. "I get it. It's a fine line to walk. You don't want to be the diversity speaker, but at the same time, your voice matters. And if Brian is serious about making changes at his company, maybe you showing up could push him in the right direction." Leah sighed, picking at her food. "I just don't want to feel like I'm being used." "You won't be," Sophia said firmly. "Not if you go in there with your terms. You're not just speaking for them. You're speaking for yourself. And for all the women, all the people of color who need to hear your story." Leah smiled, grateful for Sophia's support. "You always know what to say." Sophia grinned. "That's why you keep me around." Leah made her decision that night. She would speak at Brian's event, but she would do it her way. In the weeks leading up to Brian's event, Leah found herself balancing the demands of her job with the task of preparing for her speech. She spent her days in the trauma ward, performing life-saving surgeries and mentoring young residents like Amanda, and her evenings writing and rewriting the speech she would give at Brian's company. It wasn't easy. Every time Leah sat down to write, she was reminded of the emotional toll it took to constantly speak out against the biases and assumptions she faced. But she also knew that this was a moment to push back, to make people, especially people like Brian, truly understand the weight of their privilege. One evening, Leah sat at her desk, her laptop opened in front of her, as she tried to put her thoughts into words. The speech had to be more than just a recounting of her experiences. It had to challenge the audience, make them uncomfortable, make them question the systems they had taken for granted. She wrote, "Being a black woman in medicine means constantly proving yourself. It means working twice as hard, only to be met with half the recognition. It means walking into a room and knowing that people will doubt you before you even speak. But it also means resilience. It means strength. And it means that despite all the obstacles, you still rise." Leah stared at the words on the screen, a lump forming in her throat. This was her story, but it was also the story of so many others like her. Women who had been overlooked, doubted, and dismissed. Women who had fought to carve out a space for themselves in a world that wasn't built for them. As she continued writing, Leah felt a sense of determination settle over her. She would speak her truth, and she would make sure that Brian and everyone else in the room understood that change wasn't about feeling guilty, it was about doing the work. The day of the event arrived, and Leah found herself standing in front of a crowd of Brian's employees, many of whom were white male executives who had likely never had to confront their own biases. The room was sleek and modern, filled with rows of chairs, a podium, and the hum of conversation. Leah's heart raced as she stepped up to the podium, her palms slightly sweaty as she gripped the edges. Public speaking had never been her favorite thing, but this wasn't just a speech. This was a moment to confront the assumptions that had followed her throughout her career. Brian introduced her, his voice filled with gratitude and respect, but Leah barely registered his words. Her focus was on the crowd in front of her, the people she needed to reach. As she began to speak, Leah's voice was steady, but her words carried the weight of her experiences. "I've spent my entire career in a field where people don't expect someone who looks like me to succeed," Leah said, her gaze sweeping across the audience. "I've walked into operating rooms where patients assumed I was a nurse, not the lead surgeon. I've had colleagues question my decisions, not because of my skills, but because of my skin color. And I've had to fight every day to prove that I belong." The room was silent as Leah continued, her words cutting through the air like a scalpel. "But this isn't about my experiences alone," Leah said. "This is about the systems that allow those experiences to exist. It's about the biases we carry, the assumptions we make, and the ways in which we uphold those systems, even when we don't realize it." Leah paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. "Change isn't easy," she said. "But it starts with recognizing that we all have a role to play. It starts with challenging our own assumptions and committing to doing the work." When Leah finished, the room erupted into applause, but she wasn't interested in the applause. What mattered was whether the people in that room, especially Brian, would take her words to heart. As Leah stepped down from the podium, Brian approached her, his expression filled with something close to awe. "That was incredible," he said. "Thank you, Leah, truly." Leah nodded, but her expression remained serious. "Words are only the beginning, Brian. What matters is what you do next." Brian nodded, his face solemn. "I understand, and I'm committed to doing the work." Leah hoped he meant it. In the days following the event, Leah felt a sense of relief. She had spoken her truth, and while she wasn't sure what the impact would be, she knew that she had done her part. Now it was up to Brian and the people in that room to follow through. But for Leah, the journey was far from over. There were still surgeries to perform, residents to mentor, and systems to challenge. And as she walked through the halls of Mount Sinai, her white coat billowing behind her, Leah felt a renewed sense of purpose. She had fought to get where she was, and she would keep fighting not just for herself, but for the next generation of doctors who would follow in her footsteps. Because change wasn't a destination, it was a journey. And Leah Foster was just getting started. In the days after the event at Brian's company, Leah couldn't shake the feeling of vulnerability that came with sharing her story. While she had spoken her truth, she wasn't sure if her words had truly landed with those in the audience, or if they had just seen her speech as a token performance to ease their collective guilt. Leah had spent too many years dealing with well-meaning people who felt sorry but never acted on their newfound awareness. But as the days turned into weeks, small signs of change began to surface. First, it came in the form of an email from Brian, thanking Leah once again for her participation and letting her know that the event had sparked important conversations within his company. He shared that some employees had expressed a desire to explore anti-racist practices, and that the company was beginning to rethink its hiring and promotion strategies to ensure more diversity at all levels. Leah wasn't one to be easily impressed by corporate promises, but Brian's email felt different. He wasn't just paying lip service. He was outlining concrete steps, including internal bias training and a diversity task force. It was a start, and Leah couldn't help but feel a small sense of accomplishment. Her words had made a difference. Still, Leah knew that change was a long and arduous process. It wasn't enough to spark conversation. Real change required sustained effort. She had seen it too many times in the medical field, where diversity initiatives often failed to address the deeper systemic issues that kept people of color from advancing. As Leah moved through her days at Mount Sinai, juggling her role as a trauma surgeon and mentor, She found herself thinking more about the role she played in the broader fight for equity. Her experiences had shaped her into a strong advocate for change, but there were moments, quiet moments, usually late at night, when Leah felt the exhaustion of always being the one who had to speak up, the one who had to educate, the one who had to fight for what should have been given. Leah had always been careful to maintain a balance between her professional and personal life, though it had never been easy. For years, her career had taken precedence over everything else, leaving little room for relationships, friendships, or even her own self-care. But after her trip to Miami, Leah had resolved to do better, to take time for herself and to nurture the parts of her life that didn't revolve around the hospital. Still, as the months went by, Leah found herself falling back into old patterns. She worked long hours, stayed late reviewing patient files, and spent most of her evenings thinking about the next surgery or the next crisis that would inevitably come through the ER doors. Her conversations with Brian had reminded her of how much emotional labor she carried, not just as a doctor, but as a black woman in a world that often demanded more from her than it did from others. One evening, after a particularly grueling surgery that left her physically and emotionally drained, Leah sat in her office staring blankly at her phone. Sophia had invited her to dinner, but Leah couldn't summon the energy to go. She knew that she needed to step away from the hospital to reconnect with her friends and with herself, but the weight of her responsibilities kept her tethered to her desk. Her phone buzzed, and Leah glanced down to see a text from Amanda. Amanda. Dr. Foster, thank you for everything you've done for me. I wouldn't be where I am without your guidance. I hope I can make you proud. Leah felt a swell of emotion as she read the message. Amanda had grown so much in the past year, finding her confidence as a surgeon and becoming a leader in the trauma ward. Leah had watched her transform from a nervous resident into a capable and poised doctor, and she couldn't help but feel a deep sense of pride. But Amanda's message also made Leah reflect on her own journey. She had spent so many years mentoring others, helping them find their way, that she had almost forgotten to nurture her own growth. Leah had been so focused on survival, on proving herself in a world that often doubted her, that she hadn't allowed herself the space to grow beyond that. Leah typed back a quick response to Amanda, offering words of encouragement, but the conversation left her with a nagging feeling. She had poured so much of herself into her work, but what was left for her? The next few weeks were a blur of surgeries, meetings, and long nights spent at the hospital. Leah had always prided herself on her ability to keep everything together, but lately, she had begun to feel cracks forming in her carefully constructed facade. The stress was starting to wear on her, and no matter how hard she tried to shake it off, Leah couldn't ignore the signs that she was approaching burnout. One evening, as Leah was leaving the hospital after a particularly long shift, she felt a sharp pain in her chest. She paused, clutching her chest as the pain radiated down her arm. Panic surged through her. Was she having a heart attack? Leah leaned against the wall, trying to steady her breathing. She had spent years caring for others, but in that moment, she realized just how little she had cared for herself. The irony wasn't lost on her. A trauma surgeon who had spent her career saving lives, now finding herself in a medical crisis of her own making. The pain subsided after a few minutes, but Leah knew she couldn't ignore it. She went to the ER, where one of her colleagues ran tests to ensure she wasn't experiencing a serious cardiac event. The results came back normal. No heart attack, no underlying condition. It was stress. Pure, unrelenting stress that had pushed her body to its limit. As Leah sat in the hospital bed waiting for the discharge papers, she felt a wave of guilt and frustration. She had known this was coming, she had felt the warning signs, but she had pushed through, convincing herself that she could handle it. But now Leah had to confront the truth. She couldn't keep living like this. She had to make a change, not just for her career, but for her health and well-being. Leah took a few days off after the incident in the ER, something she hadn't done in years. It felt strange, waking up in the morning without the rush to get to the hospital, without the constant pull of her pager or the pressure of her patients' lives resting on her shoulders. She spent those days reflecting on her life, on the choices she had made, and on the path she had been walking for so long. Sophia came over one afternoon, bringing lunch and a listening ear. "You scared the hell out of me, you know," Sophia said, her tone half joking but laced with concern. "When I heard you were in the ER, I couldn't believe it." Leah sighed, leaning back on the couch. "Believe me, I didn't see it coming either, but I should have." Sophia raised an eyebrow. "Should have?" Leah nodded. "I've been running on empty for a long time. I kept telling myself I could handle it, that I didn't need to slow down, but my body had other plans." Sophia was quiet for a moment before speaking. "Leah, you've been carrying so much for so long, between your work, mentoring, and everything else. It's no wonder you're exhausted." Leah stared at the floor, her mind racing with thoughts of everything she had put on hold, her personal life, her health, her happiness. "You need to find a balance," Sophia continued. "You can't keep giving everything to your work and leave nothing for yourself." Leah knew Sophia was right. She had been living in survival mode for so long that she had forgotten how to live fully. But changing her habits, stepping away from the constant pressure, wasn't easy. "I don't know how to do that," Leah admitted, her voice soft. "I've spent so many years being the best, proving myself that I don't know how to let go." Sophia reached out and placed a hand on Leah's shoulder. "You've already proven yourself. You don't have to carry this alone. Let people help you. Let yourself rest." Leah nodded, tears welling in her eyes. She had always been strong, always been the one people relied on, but maybe it was time to let herself be vulnerable, to allow others to support her. Leah returned to work the following week, but something had shifted. She had made a decision to start prioritizing her own well-being, to create boundaries that allowed her to do her job without sacrificing her health. It wasn't an easy change. Years of overworking had conditioned her to believe that rest was a luxury she couldn't afford, but Leah was determined to stick to it. She started small, leaving the hospital at a reasonable hour, saying no to tasks that could be delegated and making time for herself outside of work. She reconnected with friends, took up yoga, and even allowed herself the indulgence of taking weekends off, something that had once felt impossible. At the same time, Leah found herself doubling down on her role as a mentor. She spent more time with Amanda, helping her navigate the challenges of residency and offering guidance on how to maintain a work-life balance, something Leah had struggled with for years. Amanda was thriving, and watching her grow gave Leah a sense of fulfillment that went beyond the satisfaction of a successful surgery. She saw Amanda the future of medicine, strong, capable women of color who would break down barriers and change the field for the better. One afternoon, Amanda approached Leah with a question that caught her off guard. "Dr. Foster," Amanda began, "I've been thinking a lot about my career and what I want to do after residency. I know I want to stay in trauma, but I also want to do more. To be an advocate, like you." Leah smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "You can do both, Amanda. You can be a surgeon and an advocate. The two aren't mutually exclusive." Amanda nodded, her eyes filled with determination. "I want to help create change. I want to make sure that the next generation of doctors doesn't have to face the same challenges we did." Leah's smile widened. "And you will. You're already making a difference." In that moment, Leah realized that her legacy wasn't just in the lives she saved in the operating room. It was in the lives she touched, the young doctors she mentored, and the system she fought to change. One evening, as Leah was wrapping up her shift, she received a call from Brian Whitfield. His voice was filled with excitement, and he wanted to share some news. "Leah," Brian said, "we've made some real progress at the company. We've implemented new policies, and we're seeing real change in how we approach diversity and inclusion. I couldn't have done this without you." Leah listened, her heart filled with a mixture of pride and relief. Brian had followed through on his promises, and while there was still much work to be done, this was a step in the right direction. "I'm glad to hear that, Brian," Leah said, "but remember, this is just the beginning. Change takes time, and you'll need to stay committed." Brian agreed, and after they hung up, Leah sat back in her chair, reflecting on how far she had come. The journey hadn't been easy. It had been filled with challenges, with moments of doubt and exhaustion. But Leah had found her balance. She had learned to prioritize her own well-being while continuing to make an impact on her field. She had faced burnout and came out the other side stronger, more resilient, and more determined than ever to create change, not just for herself, but for the generations of doctors who would follow in her footsteps. And as Leah left the hospital that night, she knew that she was ready for whatever came next. Leah woke up early one Saturday morning, the sunlight streaming through the windows of her apartment. It was her day off, something that had once been a rare luxury but was now becoming a regular part of her schedule. For the first time in years, Leah had begun to truly embrace rest, to give herself the space to breathe outside of her role as a trauma surgeon. She spent the morning in her kitchen sipping a cup of tea as she listened to the sounds of the city waking up outside. The constant rush of New York, its sirens, honking cars, and bustling crowds, was a far cry from the calm she had experienced in Miami months earlier, but now Leah no longer felt trapped by the noise. She had learned how to find peace even in the midst of chaos. Her phone buzzed on the counter, and Leah glanced at it, smiling as she saw a message from Amanda. "Amanda, can't believe it's almost the end of residency. I just wanted to say thank you again. You've changed my life, doctor." "Foster." Leah set the phone down, her heart swelling with pride. Amanda was nearing the end of her residency, and she had grown into a confident, capable trauma surgeon. Watching Amanda thrive had been one of Leah's greatest joys over the past few years, and it was a reminder that her work extended far beyond the operating room. She wasn't just saving lives, she was shaping the future of medicine. Leah sent a quick response back, offering words of encouragement and support. She knew Amanda would go on to do incredible things, and Leah couldn't wait to see what her former mentee would accomplish in the years to come. After finishing her tea, Leah decided to take a walk through Central Park. It had become part of her new routine, these walks, the moments of quiet reflection that helped her stay grounded. As she strolled through the park, Leah thought about how much her life had changed since that fateful flight to Miami. She had been on the verge of burnout, pushing herself to the brink, but now she had found a new sense of balance. Leah had always been a high achiever, always striving to prove herself in a world that often doubted her. But now she no longer felt the need to prove anything. She had earned her place, and she had come to realize that her worth wasn't tied to how many hours she worked or how many surgeries she performed. Her worth was inherent, and it was time to start living her life with that understanding. As Leah walked, she thought about the conversation she had with Brian Whitfield a few weeks earlier. His company was continuing to make strides toward diversity and inclusion, and while there was still a long way to go, Brian had kept his promise to do the work. Leah had been skeptical at first, but Brian's commitment had proven genuine, and his company's culture was beginning to shift in meaningful ways. Leah was proud of the impact she had made, but she was also keenly aware that this was just one small victory in a much larger fight. There were still systemic issues in both the corporate and medical worlds that needed to be addressed, and Leah knew she would continue to advocate for change, But now she was doing it on her terms, no longer carrying the burden of educating others on her own. A few months later, Mount Sinai hosted a small ceremony to celebrate the end of the residency program for the current cohort. Leah sat in the front row, watching proudly as Amanda and the other residents she had mentored over the years walked across the stage to receive their certificates. It was a moment of pride, not just for the residents, but for Leah as well. She had played a significant role in shaping their careers, and she knew that the medical field would be in good hands with this next generation of doctors. When Amanda's name was called, Leah couldn't help but clap a little louder, her heart swelling with pride, as her mentee crossed the stage with a confident smile. Amanda had come so far, from the nervous, uncertain resident who had struggled to find her voice to a skilled and self-assured surgeon ready to take on the world. After the ceremony, Leah found herself surrounded by the residents she had mentored, each one offering their thanks and expressing how much she had influenced their journeys. Leah smiled, taking it all in. These were the moments that made all the hard work, the late nights, and the emotional toll of her career worth it. Amanda approached Leah with a smile. "I don't think I'd be standing here today if it weren't for you," she said, her voice filled with gratitude. Leah shook her head, her expression soft. "You did the work, Amanda. I just helped you see what you were capable of." Amanda's eyes shone with emotion. "You've been more than a mentor to me. You've been an inspiration." Leah felt a lump form in her throat. She had spent so much of her career focused on proving herself, but now she realized that her true legacy would be in the lives of the people she had touched, the doctors she had helped shape. Amanda's words were a reminder that the impact Leah had made would continue long after she hung up her scrubs. A few weeks after the residency ceremony, Leah was approached by the hospital's administration with an offer to take on a new role as the head of diversity and inclusion for Mount Sinai. It was a position that would allow Leah to influence the hospital's hiring practices, its culture, and its approach to mentorship in a more formal capacity. At first, Leah wasn't sure if she wanted the job. She had always been a surgeon first, and the idea of stepping into a more administrative role felt like a departure from what she loved most about her work. But as Leah thought about the impact she could have, not just on her patients, but on the entire culture of the hospital, she began to see the offer in a new light. This role wasn't about giving up surgery. It was about expanding her influence, about ensuring that the next generation of doctors, nurses, and medical staff felt supported, seen, and valued. Leah had spent her entire career fighting for a seat at the table, and now she had the opportunity to make sure that others didn't have to fight as hard. After some consideration, Leah accepted the offer. She would continue to perform surgeries, but she would also take on the responsibility of shaping Mount Sinai's future, a future that would be more inclusive, more equitable, and more just. One day, as Leah was walking through the halls of Mount Sinai, she ran into Brian Whitfield. It had been months since they last spoke, and Leah was surprised to see him at the hospital. Brian greeted her with a smile, and Leah noticed that he seemed more at ease than the last time they had spoken. "Leah, it's good to see you," Brian said, extending a hand. Leah shook his hand, her curiosity piqued. "What brings you to Mount Sinai?" Brian's expression turned serious. "I'm actually here to talk to the board about a new initiative we're working on at the company. We've partnered with a few hospitals, including Mount Sinai, to create a scholarship fund for underrepresented medical students. It's something I've been working on since our last conversation." Leah raised an eyebrow, impressed. "That's a great initiative. I'm glad to see you're following through." Brian nodded. "I've learned a lot over the past year. You've been a big part of that. I realize that if I really want to make a difference, I need to put my money where my mouth is." Leah smiled, feeling a sense of satisfaction. She had been wary of Brian at first, unsure if his promises of change were genuine, but he had proven that he was willing to do the work. His company's partnership with Mount Sinai was just one small part of a larger effort to create systemic change, but it was a step in the right direction. As they said their goodbyes, Leah couldn't help but feel a sense of closure. Brian had come full circle, and while Leah knew that his journey, and hers, was far from over, it was gratifying to see that her influence had made a real difference. A year after taking on her new role as head of diversity and inclusion at Mount Sinai, Leah was invited to give a keynote speech at a national medical conference. The topic was creating an inclusive future in medicine, and Leah knew that her story was an important part of that conversation. As she stood on the stage in front of hundreds of medical professionals, Leah felt a sense of calm wash over her. This was her moment to share not just her journey, but the lessons she had learned along the way. Leah began her speech by talking about her early years in medicine, about the challenges she had faced and the barriers she had overcome. She spoke candidly about the biases that still existed in the field, the microaggressions that women of color faced, and the need for systemic change. But Leah didn't just focus on the challenges. She spoke about the hope she had for the future, about the young doctors she had mentored, and about the ways in which the medical field was beginning to shift. "We are the ones who will shape the future of medicine," Leah said, her voice steady and strong. "And it's up to us to make sure that future is one where everyone, regardless of their race, gender, or background, has the opportunity to thrive." When she finished, the audience erupted into applause, but Leah's mind wasn't on the applause. It was on the people in the audience, the next generation of doctors, nurses, and medical professionals who would carry on the work she had started. As Leah stepped off the stage, she felt a deep sense of fulfillment. Her journey had been long and challenging, but it had been worth it. She had made an impact, not just on her patients, but on the entire field of medicine. And as Leah walked out of the conference hall, she knew that her legacy was just beginning. Leah Foster's journey is a testament to the power of resilience, determination, and the ability to create lasting change. Through her work as a trauma surgeon, mentor, and advocate, Leah has not only saved lives but has also paved the way for the next generation of doctors to thrive in a more inclusive and equitable environment. If Leah's story has inspired you, and if you believe in the power of challenging biases and fighting for equity in all aspects of life, we invite you to join us in this mission. Subscribe to our channel to stay connected with more stories that challenge perspectives, promote growth, and inspire change. Together, we can continue making a difference. Leave a comment with your thoughts, and let us know how you're creating change in your community. See you in the next story, one that's sure to be just as impactful, if not more, as we continue to explore stories of courage, perseverance, and transformation. You're always welcome here.